It all began on what should have been a perfect Saturday morning. The sky stretched endlessly blue above my ranch, not a cloud in sight. The kind of day that makes you grateful to have open land and people to share it with. I had spent the entire week preparing for this gathering, my annual summer barbecue that had become something of a tradition among family and friends. My ranch sits on 15 acres of beautiful countryside that has been in my family for 3 generations. The land tells our story, from the old oak tree my grandfather planted when he first bought the property to the renovated barn where we now hold gatherings during rainy weather. Every inch of this place holds memories. Every corner represents hard work and dedication. I stood at the edge of my yard, surveying the setup. The tables were arranged perfectly under the shade of the oak trees. Red checkered tablecloths fluttered slightly in the gentle breeze. The coolers were stocked with drinks, and the grill was clean and ready for action. Everything was in place for what promised to be a day filled with laughter, good food, and better company. At around 11 in the morning, guests began to arrive. First came my sister with her husband and their 3 children. Then old friends from college days showed up bearing side dishes and desserts. Soon, the quiet ranch was alive with voices, laughter, and the excited squeals of children playing tag across the open field. I fired up the grill, and the air filled with the mouth-watering aroma of seasoned meat and wood smoke. "This is what life is all about," my brother-in-law commented as he handed me a cold drink. "Open spaces, family, no one telling you what to do." I nodded in agreement, not knowing how ironic his statement would soon become. It was around 1 in the afternoon when I first noticed her. A woman I had never seen before stood at the edge of my property line, her face pinched with disapproval. She wore pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt, as if dressed for a country club rather than a rural area. What caught my attention most was the clipboard she clutched against her chest like a shield. She scribbled something down, then continued to stare at our gathering with undisguised contempt. I tried to ignore her presence, focusing instead on flipping burgers and ensuring my guests were enjoying themselves. But her hovering presence at the edge of my property created an uncomfortable sensation, like a storm cloud threatening a sunny day. Eventually, curiosity and concern got the better of me. I handed the spatula to my brother and walked across the yard toward the woman. As I approached, she straightened her posture and lifted her chin slightly, as if preparing for confrontation. "Good afternoon," I said, extending my hand. "Can I help you with something?" She did not take my offered hand. Instead, she adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat formally. "I am Margaret Winters, Secretary of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association," she announced, her voice crisp and official. "You are in violation of multiple community regulations." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. Homeowners Association. My property had never been part of any HOA. We were too far out in the country, too removed from the suburban developments where such organizations typically held power. "There must be some mistake," I replied calmly. "This ranch is private property. We are not part of any association." Margaret's lips thinned into a tight line. "Perhaps you are unaware, but the recent land development agreement placed the eastern portion of your property within our jurisdiction, and you are currently in violation of noise regulations, unauthorized gathering permits, and," she wrinkled her nose distastefully, "smoke ordinances." "I have owned this land free and clear for over 15 years, I explained, struggling to maintain my politeness. "There has never been any HOA involvement here." She thrust her clipboard forward, showing me a crude map with arbitrary lines drawn across what appeared to be a representation of my property. "The boundary was established last year. You should have received notification. and now you are facing fines for each violation." The music and laughter behind me suddenly felt vulnerable, threatened by this woman's intrusion. "Look, Ms. Winters, this is a private family gathering on private property. I appreciate your concern, but there has been a misunderstanding. The fine schedule will be delivered to you formally," she continued as if I had not spoken. "I suggest you disperse this gathering immediately to avoid additional penalties." I felt my face growing warm, not from the nearby grill but from rising indignation. "Thank you for the information. I will look into this matter, but for now, my guests are staying and our barbecue will continue." Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "You have been warned." As she turned and marched away, clipboard still clutched tightly, I returned to my grill and friends, trying to shake off the encounter. I brushed it off as a misunderstanding or perhaps a power-hungry individual overstepping boundaries. How wrong I was. That brief interaction was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The following morning dawned peaceful and quiet. Birds chirped in the trees surrounding my ranch house, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through my kitchen window. I made coffee and prepared a simple breakfast, reflecting on the successful gathering from the day before. Despite the strange interruption from the self-proclaimed HOA secretary, the party had continued without further incident. Children had played until sunset. Adults had shared stories around the fire pit, and everyone had left with full stomachs and happy hearts. I stepped onto my front porch with my coffee mug in hand, breathing in the fresh morning air. That was when I noticed it. An envelope aggressively attached to my front gate with multiple strips of duct tape, as if the sender feared a gentle breeze might carry away their message before I could receive it. The envelope was bright yellow with "Official Notice" printed in bold red letters across the front. With a growing sense of unease, I walked down my gravel driveway to retrieve the envelope. The tape had been applied with such force that it pulled paint from my gate when I removed it. Inside was a letter printed on official-looking letterhead for Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. The contents turned my peaceful morning bitter. The letter outlined numerous alleged violations from the previous day's gathering: excessive noise pollution exceeding permitted decibel levels, unauthorized smoke emissions affecting neighborhood air quality, unlicensed public gathering exceeding 20 persons, and failure to submit event application forms 30 days prior. At the bottom of the page, a table detailed the fines: $250 for each violation, totaling $1,000, with an additional $100 per day until full compliance is achieved and documented. The letter was signed with a flourishing signature: Margaret Winters, HOA Secretary. My hands shook slightly as I read through the document again. This was absurd. My property had never been subject to such regulations, and the nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile away. How could my barbecue smoke possibly affect neighborhood air quality? After finishing my now-cold coffee, I dressed quickly and drove to the address listed on the letterhead. It appeared to be a small office building on the edge of town, with Whispering Pines HOA displayed on a modest sign out front. But when I arrived, the office was locked and dark. A small note on the door indicated office hours were by appointment only. I called the number on the letterhead multiple times. Each call went to voicemail. I left increasingly frustrated messages requesting clarification about the alleged violations and questioning the HOA's jurisdiction over my property. On my drive home, I stopped at my neighbor Frank's house. Frank had lived in the area even longer than I had and might know something about this so-called boundary change. "HOA, out here," Frank laughed when I explained the situation. That is the most ridiculous thing I have heard all year." His amusement faded when I showed him the letter. "This same lady came after the Johnsons last summer," Frank revealed, examining the signature. "They were smoking meat in their backyard smoker, and she claimed it violated some air quality provision. They ended up paying just to make her go away." "Did their property suddenly fall within HOA boundaries too?" I asked. Frank shook his head. "Never heard anything about boundary changes. Sounds like nonsense to me. But this Margaret person, she is persistent, like a dog with a bone." By the time I returned home, a plan was forming in my mind. If this was going to escalate, and something told me it would, I needed documentation. I spent the afternoon taking photographs of my property lines, digging out my original deed and property surveys, and researching county zoning regulations. Nothing I found suggested any recent boundary changes or HOA annexation of rural properties. I also ordered a professional decibel meter online for next-day delivery. If noise violations were going to be thrown at me, I would have empirical evidence of actual sound levels. That evening, feeling frustrated and seeking some sense of community support, I composed a careful post on my personal Facebook page. I detailed the events without inflammatory language, just the facts about a seemingly unfounded HOA claim against my private property and the substantial fines being threatened. I asked if anyone in the area had experienced similar issues. I went to bed expecting perhaps a few sympathetic comments from friends. What I did not expect was to wake up to hundreds of reactions, comments, and shares. Apparently, Margaret Winters and the Whispering Pines HOA had made numerous enemies over the years with similar tactics. My simple post had struck a nerve, and people were angry on my behalf. "She tried the same thing with my grandmother," one comment read. "Threatened to fine her for her bird feeders attracting wildlife nuisances." Another person wrote, "They claimed jurisdiction over my property too, but when I had my lawyer contact them, they suddenly could not find my paperwork." The post continued to gain traction throughout the day, eventually being shared by a local community action page with thousands of followers. What had begun as a personal frustration was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare for the Whispering Pines HOA. Little did I know, Margaret Winters was just getting started, and so was I. Over the next week, the yellow envelopes kept coming, each more threatening than the last. The second notice arrived just 3 days after the first, informing me that my failure to respond promptly had resulted in an additional administrative processing fee of $150. The third notice, which appeared 2 days later, included new violations I had supposedly committed. Potential fire hazard due to unauthorized outdoor cooking equipment. This claim was particularly absurd considering I lived in a rural area where outdoor cooking was commonplace. Illegal public gathering without proper permits and safety inspections. My family barbecue had somehow been reclassified as a public event requiring government permission. Each letter was more aggressive in tone than the previous one. The final paragraph of the latest notice stated that continued noncompliance will necessitate involvement of local authorities to ensure community safety standards are maintained. I placed each letter in a dedicated folder, creating a paper trail of what increasingly felt like harassment. The casual comfort I once felt on my own property was eroding. Each time I heard a vehicle approaching, I tensed, wondering if it was another HOA representative or worse. My concern proved warranted on Thursday afternoon. I was repairing a fence post when I heard the distinctive sound of tires on gravel. A county police cruiser rolled slowly up my driveway, stopping near my workshop. My heart pounded as I set down my tools and walked toward the vehicle. The officer who stepped out looked uncomfortable with the situation. He was young, probably new to the force, and kept adjusting his belt as he approached me. "Good afternoon, sir," he began formally. "I am Officer Davis with the county police. We received a complaint about unauthorized construction and possible code violations at this address. Just here to check things out." I took a deep breath before responding. "Officer Davis, I appreciate you doing your job. Would you mind telling me who filed this complaint?" He hesitated before answering. "A representative from the local HOA called it in. Said there were multiple ongoing violations, including unauthorized structures." I nodded slowly. "I would be happy to show you my property and documentation. What specific violations are you investigating today?" The officer looked down at his notepad. "Ooh, unpermitted construction activity, fire safety hazards, and improper land use." I gestured toward the fence post I had been fixing. "That is the only construction happening here today. Maintaining an existing fence on property I have owned for 15 years. For the next 20 minutes, I walked Officer Davis around my property. I showed him my land deed, property surveys, and building permits for every structure on the ranch. He took notes, occasionally radioing information back to dispatch. "Everything seems to be in order, sir," he finally concluded. "I do not see any violations that would warrant police involvement." As he prepared to leave, I asked one final question. "Officer, has the HOA called about other properties in this area recently?" He paused before answering carefully. "I cannot comment specifically, but I would say we have had an increase in calls regarding code enforcement in this district. Most turn out to be, well, like this one." After the police visit, I contacted the land use attorney I had been recommended. Her name was Sofia Rodriguez, and she specialized in rural property disputes. Her consultation fee was steep, but I needed professional guidance. "Based on what you have told me and the documentation you have provided," Sophia said during our meeting, "there is no legal way your property could have been incorporated into this HOA without your knowledge and consent. Something very strange is happening here." She recommended I continue documenting everything while she investigated the HOA's legal standing. "Pull every record you can," she advised. "Look for irregularities in their bylaws, board meeting minutes, anything that might explain why they suddenly claim jurisdiction over your property." That night, I dug into public records available online. The Whispering Pines HOA had been established 12 years ago to govern a small planned community about 2 miles from my property. Their bylaws, which I found buried on a poorly maintained website, had not been updated in over a decade. Nothing in them mentioned expansion of boundaries or incorporation of existing properties. More concerning were the whispered conversations I was having with friends who had planned to attend my next gathering. "Maybe we should wait until this blows over," one suggested. "I do not want to cause you more trouble." Another friend was more direct. "Those HOA people can make your life miserable. My cousin lost his house fighting one in Arizona." The isolation tactics were working. My home, once a hub for community and connection, was becoming a place people hesitated to visit. The damage being done went far beyond financial threats. It was affecting my place in the community. That night I made a decision. If Margaret Winters wanted a fight, she would get one. But we would be fighting on my terms, not hers. Monday morning found me standing in the lobby of the county land management office, clutching a folder filled with documentation. I had spent the weekend organizing every piece of evidence I could gather: property records dating back to my grandfather's original purchase, tax statements showing rural agricultural zoning, and all the threatening letters from the HOA. The clerk directed me to Gerald Thompson, a county official who had worked in the department for over 30 years. His office was small but meticulously organized, with maps covering most of the wall space. He listened patiently as I explained the situation, occasionally nodding or frowning as I presented my evidence. "This is not the first complaint we have received about this particular HOA," Gerald said after I finished. "There have been several reports of overreach in the past 2 years, but nothing concrete enough to warrant official investigation." "So they have been doing this to others?" I asked. Gerald adjusted his glasses. "Similar stories, yes. They send official-looking notices, claim jurisdiction over properties that have never been part of their development, and threaten fines. Most people either ignore them or pay small amounts to make the problem go away. No one has formally challenged them." "I am challenging them now," I said firmly. Gerald helped me file an official complaint with the county, documenting the harassment and jurisdictional dispute. "This will trigger a review of their charter and operations," he explained. "But these things move slowly. Do not expect immediate results." As I left the county office, a plan was forming in my mind. If bureaucracy would move slowly, I needed to fight on another front simultaneously, one that would be far more public. I decided to host another barbecue, not just any gathering, but a charity fundraiser for the local animal shelter that had recently suffered damage in a storm. I spent the next 2 days organizing, making phone calls, and sending invitations. This time, I did everything by the book, obtaining a temporary event permit from the county, hiring a professional safety inspector, and even arranging for proper parking with traffic cones. I also invited local media, explaining that we were raising funds for animals in need. The small local newspaper and a regional news blog both expressed interest in covering the event. Most importantly, I personally invited Sheriff Clark, who had been looking for community support for the animal shelter project. The day of the fundraiser arrived with perfect weather, warm sunshine, gentle breeze, and clear skies. Volunteers from the animal shelter arrived early to set up an information booth. Several dogs available for adoption were brought in, wearing Adopt Me bandanas. Food tables were organized, the grill was ready, and donation boxes were placed strategically throughout the property. People began arriving around noon. The turnout was better than I had hoped. Families with children played with the shelter dogs, community members chatted about local issues, and the donation boxes filled steadily. Sheriff Clark arrived with 2 deputies, all off-duty but in uniform, creating an official presence that gave me a sense of security. "This is a wonderful thing you are doing for the shelter," the sheriff said, accepting a plate of barbecue. "We need more community events like this." It was almost 2 hours into the event when I spotted them, Margaret Winters and a tall, stern-looking man I presumed to be her husband. She wore the same disapproving expression I remembered, but now she also sported a small camera clipped to her collar. Her husband held a larger video camera, filming as they approached the entrance to my property. I excused myself from a conversation and walked toward them, determined to handle the situation calmly and publicly. Sheriff Clark, noticing the tension in my posture, followed a few steps behind me. "Mr. Winters, I presume," I said, extending my hand to the man with the camera. He ignored my gesture, continuing to film. Margaret stepped forward, clipboard at the ready. "This event was not approved by the HOA board," she announced loudly, clearly hoping to be overheard by nearby guests. You are in violation of multiple bylaws and will be fined accordingly. Sheriff Clark stepped forward. Afternoon, folks. Is there a problem here? Margaret turned to him, momentarily startled by his uniform. This property owner is hosting an unauthorized event in violation of community regulations. The sheriff looked at me. Do you have a permit for this gathering, sir? I nodded and withdrew the county permit from my pocket, unfolding it for both the sheriff and Margaret to see. County-approved temporary event permit for a charity fundraiser. All safety inspections completed yesterday. Margaret's face flushed red. That is irrelevant. HOA approval is still required for any gathering of this size. Sheriff Clark took the permit and examined it. This appears to be in order. This property is zoned as rural agricultural, outside city limits. County approval is the only requirement for legal gatherings of this nature. This property falls within Whispering Pines' HOA jurisdiction, Margaret insisted, her voice rising slightly. We have documentation. I would like to see that documentation, Sheriff Clark said calmly. Because county records show this property has never been rezoned or incorporated into any planned community. Margaret's husband lowered his camera slightly. We will provide the documentation to the proper authorities, he said. I am the proper authority, Sheriff Clark replied, his tone remaining professional but firm. And I would advise against making false claims of jurisdiction or harassing property owners who are clearly operating within the law. Margaret's face turned from red to pale. We are not harassing anyone. We are enforcing community standards. Ma'am, the sheriff continued, continuing to make these claims without legal standing could be considered harassment. I suggest you take any actual concerns through proper legal channels rather than disrupting a charity event. The confrontation had drawn attention. Several guests had moved closer, phones raised, recording the exchange. Margaret noticed the cameras and tugged at her husband's sleeve. This is not over, she said to me, her voice low but intense. The HOA board will be reviewing this incident. As they retreated to their car, the sheriff turned to me. You might want to consider filing for a harassment order if this continues. What they are doing is not right. I thanked him, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time since this ordeal began, I had confronted the bullying in public, with witnesses. The cameras had captured everything: Margaret's unfounded claims, her husband's intimidation tactics, and most importantly, the sheriff confirming that my property was not under HOA jurisdiction. The fundraiser continued successfully, raising over $3,000 for the animal shelter. But more valuable than the money was the community support I felt surrounding me. The isolation tactics had failed. The war was far from over, but I had won an important battle. And this time, the evidence was not just in my possession. It was being shared across social media by dozens of witnesses. The confrontation at the fundraiser had shifted the dynamic significantly. No longer was I simply defending my property. I was actively uncovering the truth about Margaret Winters and the Whispering Pines HOA. My attorney, Sophia Rodriguez, had been investigating behind the scenes, and 2 days after the fundraiser, she called with interesting news. I found something you should see, she said, her voice containing a hint of excitement that legal professionals rarely reveal. Can you come to my office this afternoon? When I arrived, Sophia's desk was covered with documents, property records, permits, and what appeared to be financial statements. She gestured for me to sit as she organized the papers into neat piles. First, she began, I confirmed what we suspected. Your property has never been legally incorporated into the Whispering Pines HOA. Their jurisdiction ends a full mile from your property line. This was not surprising, but having legal confirmation was reassuring. Sophia then pushed forward a different set of documents. This is where it gets interesting. I pulled public records on all board members, including our friend Margaret Winters. Her house, she pointed to an address highlighted in yellow, is actually in violation of 3 separate zoning ordinances. She showed me aerial photographs and permit applications. The Winters added a sunroom and expanded their back deck 4 years ago without proper permits. They also converted their garage into an apartment that they rent out, which violates single-family zoning in their area. So the enforcer is actually the violator, I said, the irony not lost on me. Sophia nodded. Exactly, and there is more. The HOA's financial records show some concerning patterns. The financial statements revealed that fines collected from alleged violations were not being properly accounted for. Large sums disappeared into vaguely labeled categories like administrative expenses and community improvements with no specific details. Is that illegal? I asked. It is certainly improper, Sophia replied, and potentially fraudulent if they cannot document how these funds were used. HOAs are required to maintain transparent financial records for their members. Armed with this information, I began reaching out to other homeowners in the actual Whispering Pines development. Most were reluctant to speak at first, clearly fearful of becoming targets themselves. But one resident, an elderly woman named Alina who had lived there since the community was built, agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in town. Margaret and her husband took over the board 3 years ago, Alina explained, keeping her voice low despite the cafe being nearly empty. Before that, we had quarterly meetings, transparent budgets, and actual community events. Now the meetings are rare, and when they happen, no one dares question anything. Alina introduced me to 2 other residents who shared similar concerns. Together, we formed a small alliance, communicating through a private group chat to avoid drawing attention. They provided me with meeting minutes, copies of the original HOA bylaws, and a list of other residents who might support reform efforts. The next step was to attend an HOA meeting in person. According to the bylaws, these meetings were supposed to be open to all property owners within the development. My new allies informed me that a quarterly budget meeting was scheduled for the following week. When the evening of the meeting arrived, I dressed professionally and arrived early at the community center. Alina and the others were already there, sitting together near the back. Other residents filtered in, filling the rows of chairs set up in the small room. At precisely 7 o'clock, Margaret Winters and 4 other board members entered and took their places at a table at the front. Margaret's eyes widened momentarily when she spotted me, but she quickly composed herself and called the meeting to order. The proceedings were rigid and formal, with Margaret controlling every aspect of the discussion. When they reached the agenda item for budget review, she quickly summarized revenue and expenses without providing specific figures. "Are there any questions?" she asked perfunctorily, clearly not expecting any. I stood up. "Yes, I have several questions about the budget and other matters." The room fell silent. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped her gavel. "This meeting is for Whispering Pines residents only," she stated flatly. "That is precisely what I would like to discuss," I replied calmly. "The definition of resident seems to have been inappropriately expanded in recent years." I approached the front table and placed copies of my property records on the table. I have been receiving notices and fines from this HOA despite my property never having been legally incorporated into your jurisdiction. I would like to understand how this happened." Margaret attempted to interrupt, but I continued, my voice remaining calm but firm. "Additionally, I have concerns about the financial records of this association, specifically regarding the allocation of funds collected through fines." Several residents sat up straighter, suddenly more interested in the proceedings. "This is not the appropriate forum for such discussion," Margaret declared, banging her gavel. "Your concerns should be submitted in writing to the board." "Actually," Eleanor spoke up from the back, "according to our bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph 2, any community member has the right to address financial concerns at quarterly meetings." Other residents began to murmur. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from passive acceptance to curious engagement. "Furthermore," I continued, "I believe the residents should be aware that their HOA secretary's own property is currently in violation of 3 separate zoning ordinances, including an unpermitted rental unit." Margaret's face paled visibly. The other board members exchanged glances, clearly unaware of this information. The room erupted in whispers and concerned conversation. For the first time since this battle began, Margaret Winters looked rattled. The controlled facade had cracked, revealing the truth beneath. She was not an all-powerful authority, but simply someone who had manipulated fear and apathy to maintain control. As the meeting descended into chaos, I quietly distributed copies of my documentation to interested residents. Seeds of revolution had been planted, and they were already beginning to sprout. The aftermath of the HOA meeting spread through the community like wildfire. Within days, residents were talking openly about issues they had previously kept to themselves. Stories emerged of arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of rules, and intimidation tactics. A community that had been ruled by fear was beginning to find its voice. Eleanor, who had proven herself braver than most, offered her home as a meeting place for concerned residents. What began as a small gathering of 5 or 6 people quickly grew. By the end of the week, over 20 homeowners had joined our informal coalition. During these meetings, we discovered that the HOA bylaws included a provision for removing board members through a special petition process. If 60% of homeowners signed a petition calling for removal, a special vote would be triggered. "It will not be easy," Eleanor warned. "Many people are still afraid to stand up to her." "We do not need everyone to be brave," I replied. "We just need enough signatures to force a vote." We drafted a formal petition citing specific violations of HOA responsibilities, including financial mismanagement, selective enforcement of rules, harassment of non-HOA properties, and failure to maintain proper records. Each point was carefully documented with evidence collected over the previous weeks. Teams of 2 or 3 residents began going door to door throughout the Whispering Pines community, explaining the situation and requesting signatures. Some doors closed quickly in our faces. Others opened just enough for a hand to reach out, sign quickly, and retreat. But many residents listened, shared their own stories, and added their names to the growing list. Margaret and her allies were not idle during this time. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes warning of outside agitators and threats to property values. Residents who had openly signed the petition reported receiving violation notices for minor infractions that had been ignored for years: peeling paint, slightly overgrown grass, unauthorized bird feeders. But the intimidation tactics only strengthened our resolve. Each new attempt at retaliation provided additional evidence of abuse of power. Within 7 days, we had collected signatures from 58% of homeowners, just short of our 60% goal. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The husband of a board member, apparently tired of being associated with the increasingly controversial HOA leadership, not only signed the petition himself, but convinced 3 neighbors to add their names as well. With 63% of homeowners now supporting the removal petition, we formally submitted the document to the board, triggering the special vote process. According to the bylaws, the vote had to be scheduled within 14 days of petition submission. Margaret attempted to delay by claiming procedural irregularities in the petition, but Sophia quickly countered with legal citations from the HOA's own governing documents. The vote was scheduled for the following Saturday morning at the community center. The days leading up to the vote were tense. I received multiple threatening phone calls from blocked numbers. My mailbox was vandalized one night. Margaret filed a formal complaint with the county claiming my fundraiser had violated noise ordinances, a claim quickly dismissed when the sheriff's office confirmed they had been present and observed no violations. When Saturday morning arrived, the community center parking lot was fuller than anyone could remember for an HOA meeting. Residents who had never attended a meeting before showed up to cast their votes. A local news blogger, hearing about the controversy, positioned himself outside with a camera. Inside, the room hummed with nervous energy. Margaret and the other board members sat at their table, faces grim. As a non-resident, I could not vote, but I was allowed to attend as the initiator of the petition. I sat quietly in the back, observing the process. Margaret called the meeting to order, her voice noticeably lacking its usual authoritative tone. "We are here today to address a petition calling for my removal as secretary of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Before the vote, I am entitled to make a statement." She stood and faced the assembled residents. "I have served this community faithfully for 3 years. Everything I have done has been to maintain property values and community standards. These accusations are baseless attempts by outside interests to destabilize our neighborhood." When she finished, Alina stood and asked if others could speak before the vote. Reluctantly, Margaret agreed. Alina moved to the front of the room, her voice steady despite her age. "I have lived in Whispering Pines since the first house was built. This was once a community where neighbors helped neighbors. We had differences, but we resolved them with respect and understanding." She paused, looking directly at Margaret. In recent years, that spirit has been replaced by fear and control. Our HOA was created to serve the community, not rule it. Today, we have a chance to reclaim that original purpose. Several other residents spoke, sharing specific experiences of intimidation and unfair treatment. When all statements were complete, paper ballots were distributed. One by one, residents marked their votes and placed them in a transparent collection box. 2 neutral volunteers counted the ballots twice to ensure accuracy. The result was unambiguous. 78% had voted for removal. Margaret's face flushed deep red as the result was announced. "This meeting is a sham," she declared, gathering her papers. "You will regret this decision when your property values plummet." She stormed out, her husband following close behind. The remaining board members looked uncertain about what to do next. Alina, reading from the bylaws, pointed out that in case of an officer vacancy, a temporary replacement could be elected immediately by simple majority vote. To my surprise, several voices called out my name as a nomination. "I do not even live in your community," I protested. "The bylaws only specify that board members must be property owners," Alina explained. "Since Margaret incorrectly claimed your property was part of Whispering Pines, Perhaps we should make that temporarily true, just for the purpose of reforming our governing documents. The suggestion was met with laughter and applause. When the impromptu vote was taken, the result was unanimous. I found myself appointed as the temporary board secretary of a community I did not live in, a delicious irony that was not lost on anyone present. The remaining board members, seeming relieved rather than upset by this development, agreed to work with the new community initiative. As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, residents approached me with handshakes, hugs, and tearful thanks. She threatened to fine me $500 because my Christmas lights stayed up 3 days past their deadline, one elderly woman confided. I have been afraid to put up any decorations since. My son could not play basketball in our own driveway because she said the noise violated community standards, another resident told me. He is 14. Where else was he supposed to play? Story after story emerged, painting a picture of a community that had been living under the thumb of arbitrary rules and targeted enforcement. Many residents exchanged phone numbers for the first time, despite having lived as neighbors for years. As I prepared to leave, Alina clasped my hand firmly. Thank you for having the courage to stand up when the rest of us were too scared. You have given us our neighborhood back. Outside, Margaret's husband was loading boxes into their car while she spoke animatedly to the blogger who had been covering the meeting. When she saw me exit the building, she broke off her interview and marched in my direction. This is nothing but a witch hunt, she declared loudly. You have no idea what you have done. This community will fall apart without proper leadership. I met her gaze calmly. The community seems quite capable of governing itself, Margaret. Perhaps that was what frightened you all along. Her face contorted with anger momentarily before she regained control. This is not over, she said quietly before turning away. As I watched her drive away, I realized she was right about one thing. It was not over. The real work of rebuilding community trust and creating fair governance was just beginning. But for the first time since this conflict started, the path forward seemed clear and hopeful. The 3 months that followed the dramatic HOA meeting were busy but productive. As temporary secretary, I worked closely with Alina and other community volunteers to completely overhaul the Whispering Pines governing documents. We met weekly in the community center, drafting new bylaws line by line with input from as many residents as possible. The rules should serve the people, not control them, became our unofficial motto. We replaced vague regulations that could be selectively enforced with clear, specific guidelines developed through community consensus. The intimidating fine schedule was dismantled in favor of a more reasonable approach focused on communication and resolution rather than punishment. Financial transparency became a cornerstone of the new system. We created an online portal where all residents could view HOA income and expenses in real time. The previously nebulous administrative expenses category was eliminated entirely, with each expenditure now requiring specific description and purpose. I never thought I would enjoy reading HOA documents, one resident joked during a drafting session. But when you have a voice in creating them, it makes all the difference. Not everything went smoothly. Margaret and a small group of loyal supporters attended early meetings to voice objections to nearly every proposed change. When their disruptions failed to derail the process, they filed a complaint with the county claiming procedural violations. Sophia easily defended our actions, and the complaint was dismissed. By the time my temporary position ended, Whispering Pines had transformed. New board members were elected through a genuinely democratic process. Community events, cookouts, movie nights, garden tour became regular occurrences. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now greeted each other by name. As for my ranch, the resolution was equally satisfying. The county land management office issued an official statement confirming that my property had never been under HOA jurisdiction. They also launched an investigation into the Whispering Pines boundary claims, eventually determining that Margaret had unilaterally redrawn maps without legal authority or proper procedure. The false violation notices and threatening letters became artifacts of a bizarre chapter in my life rather than ongoing concerns. I framed the first notice, the one that had been duct-taped to my gate, and hung it prominently in my kitchen as a reminder that standing up to bullies, while difficult, is always worthwhile. My ranch resumed its role as a gathering place for friends and family. The spring following the HOA battle, I hosted the largest barbecue yet, this time as an official community fundraiser for both the animal shelter and a new playground at the local park. Residents from Whispering Pines came as invited guests rather than hostile inspectors. The sweet aroma of barbecue smoke drifted freely over my property without generating a single complaint. One particular moment from that gathering stands out in my memory. I was at the grill, turning chicken and ribs, when Eleanor approached with an elderly gentleman I had not met before. "This is Howard," she introduced him. "He has lived in Whispering Pines for 12 years but has not been to a community event since Margaret took over the board." Howard extended a weathered hand. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, his voice slightly shaky with age. "My wife passed 3 years ago and gardening became my therapy. Margaret cited me 14 times for my rose bushes being non-compliant vegetation. Eventually, I just tore them out rather than fight." He gestured toward a small potted rose bush he had brought with him. "Eleanor tells me you might have space for this in your garden. It was my wife's favorite variety." That evening, as the sun set over my ranch, Howard and I planted the rose bush near my front porch. Other guests gathered around, sharing stories of their own small victories against petty tyranny. The moment crystallized everything I had been fighting for, not just my right to host a barbecue, but the more fundamental right of people to live with dignity and community. In the years since then, I have remained involved with Whispering Pines as an informal advisor. Their new board structure has become a model for other HOAs in the county. Margaret and her husband eventually sold their house and moved away, reportedly to a gated community in another state. I sometimes wonder if they are already at war with their new neighbors. As for me, the ranch feels more like home than ever. The smoke from my grill rises uncontested into the clear country sky. Children play freely across the open fields. Laughter echoes without fear of violation notices or clipboard-wielding inspectors. The framed HOA notice still hangs in my kitchen. Visitors often ask about it, giving me the opportunity to share this story. It serves as a reminder that peace is sweetest when it has been earned rather than merely granted. That communities thrive when built on respect rather than fear. And that sometimes, the simple act of standing your ground can create ripples that transform an entire neighborhood. Sometimes, when the evening is quiet and the stars are bright above my ranch, I raise a glass to that first confrontation, to the smoke that started it all. In an odd way, I am grateful for Margaret Winters and her misguided crusade. Without her, I might never have discovered the power of community or the satisfaction of fighting for what is right. And I definitely would not have such an interesting story to tell at barbecues.